in all of his glory. Yeah, so here we have Jeremy Bentham. There's all of him. He comes up with utilitarianism, and he basically formulates his type of utilitarianism in a very scientific way. So we're going to be looking at that today. For those of you who kind of like the idea of utilitarian thought, his way of dealing with morality is a lot more calculated than, say, a relativist would go about these things. And frankly, if an egoist was to use Jeremy Bentham's utilitarian calculus to discern his or her own benefit, they would do better off than they would just kind of wandering around hoping for the best or living a purely hedonistic, pleasure-seeking lifestyle without thinking through the ramifications of their actions the way that Bentham suggests. So let's talk now about Jeremy Bentham. I've already given you the definition of utilitarian or utility. I'm going to do that again here though really quickly. It's a property in any object or action whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, good, pleasure, or happiness. That's utility. Utility is also anything that tends to prevent the happenings of pain, mischief, evil, or unhappiness. And so every action that you do has moral consequences and deserves moral calculation. There are some ethical systems that really have actions that are amoral, right? That are neither good nor bad in and of themselves, right? For instance, eating popcorn. Eating popcorn is not really a moral issue in a lot of different moral systems. However, in utilitarianism, it becomes a moral issue. It becomes a moral issue because it affects things. It maybe affects your health. It definitely affects things like the economy and those who grow the corn that is used to be popped. And so when you're thinking about how this affects you and everybody else, every action that you take basically has some moral value. Obviously, some actions have a lot more moral value and importance than others, but needless to say, every action that you do, according to utilitarianism anyway, has some sort of moral importance. So let's now figure out how we measure happiness. If we say that it's the greatest good for the greatest number, how do we measure the good? And it turns out that Jeremy Bentham has a system that he uses in order to try to calculate happiness. And there's a variety of different measures that are used in order to do this. 7 in total, according to Jeremy Bentham. And frankly, as we go through these 7 major parts of moral or philosophic calculus, you'll probably recognize that you already use them, at least on some level, when you're thinking through various possibilities in your life. What do you want to do after you leave high school? What college do you want to go to? And you look at a variety of different factors in making that decision. What career do you want? Or even when it comes to something as simple as spending the money that you earn or that you get for your allowance, you probably make fairly similar types of reasoned decisions based upon a maximum benefit. Okay, so let's walk through the 7 major pieces in Jeremy Bentham's philosophic calculus or moral calculus. And let's start with this first one. This is intensity. So once again, the question is, how do we maximize pleasure for not just the individual, but for the greatest number, and minimize pain? And so this would be true for both pain and pleasure. How intense or how strong is the pleasure or is the pain? And obviously intense pain is bad, intense pleasure is good. Now don't worry, there are other factors that you have to balance intensity with. Factors such as how long does the pleasure last, or how long does the pain last, and so on and so forth. But let's use an example here really quickly. How many of you have watched cat videos online at one point? Cats doing crazy, stupid things. Okay, so that's basically all of you. You watch cat videos. How many of you would say, on some level, watching cat videos, at least for a little while, is mildly pleasurable? Kind of funny, a little bit enjoyable, if it doesn't go on too long. How many of you would say that watching cat videos is the most intense pleasure you've ever experienced? Yeah, I didn't think so. Nobody thinks that cat videos are intensely pleasurable. They're mildly humorous at best. And so you'd ask yourself before you waste your time or spend time watching cat videos, how intense is this pleasure? And you compare that to something like seeing, I don't know, your firstborn child for the very first time. Which do you think has more intensity? Well, for most people, that's seeing your firstborn
How
for the
ugly
first.
your firstborn child is.
What was that?
I said that depends on how ugly your firstborn child is.
You know what? For some reason, most people can see right past the ugliness of their child and think it's beautiful. I don't know how. I'm not the kind that does that very easily. A lot of times I'm like, man, that kid fell out of the ugly tree and hit every single branch on the way down. Just hideous. Maybe you've thought that about babies as well. Although I think it's probably a little bit more difficult when it's your own. Here's another example of an intense pleasure, at least potentially. Cocaine. I've never done cocaine. I have no plans to do cocaine. I suggest you don't do cocaine either. But from what I hear from those who have done it, there is a very quick burst of intense pleasure upon doing cocaine. And so at least that you'd have to put in the good side of the cocaine question. There are, of course, other factors here that will show us that maybe cocaine isn't a morally appropriate thing to do. Another thing would be, how long does the pleasure last? And so in the case of cocaine, from what I understand, it wears off pretty quickly. And so it may be a short burst of intense pleasure, but it doesn't last all that long. There are other things that can be done that produce a longer lasting pleasure. And obviously, the longer the pleasure, the better it is. The longer the pain, the worse that it is. So we want to do actions that promote a long-lasting and even intense, if possible, pleasure. Now, of course, there are other things as well. So supposing cocaine, you could do cocaine and the feeling would last, 3 years. There are other problems with that we'll be looking at here in just a minute. So even if it did last a long time, that still might not necessarily put it in the positive column, the utilitarian column. Another question that you would ask is, how certain or uncertain will an action, if you take an action, will it be that pleasure or pain will be produced? And my guess is, in the case of all of these things, you guys think about this. If you're looking at spending your hard-earned money, how intense is the pleasure going to be if you buy that car? Is that the car you've always wanted? How long will it last? Well, it will last as long as the car will. And potentially, if you like the car that much, if you really think that that model or whatever is something you really like. How certain are you that the car that you are looking at purchasing will give you pleasure? Well, gosh, if it's that, 1972 Ford Bronco, well, yeah, it's going to give you pleasure. But if you're talking about that 1997 Ford Taurus, probably not. I mean, maybe a little bit. I don't know. How many of you would be pretty happy with a 97 Taurus? Okay, I realize I'm talking to San Diego Christian students here. I guess we're like, you drive nicer cars than I do in general. Not all of you, but some of you. Don't worry, I'm not judging. Knock yourself out. Okay, the next one would be propinquity or remoteness. How soon will the pleasure occur? And by the way, with the quickness of the pleasure occurring, you also know that it's more certain to actually happen. And obviously, the sooner the pleasure is experienced, is probably is better in the long run than a long ways off. And so we would look at something like, how should we spend our money, right? Should we spend our money on things only for here and the now. I like ice cream, and I like good ice cream, not the ice cream you get in those big tubs that are just kind of like almost inedible. You know what I'm talking about? Where when you have like big birthday parties, everyone's eating out this big tub of ice cream. You're like, ugh, it's not even edible. I'm talking about like good, high quality, expensive ice cream, right? Now I could spend all my money on ice cream. And that pleasure would happen pretty immediately and probably even fairly regularly, although I might get kind of fat. And before you start judging about fatness, don't. I have another example on down the line today where we'll be talking about a very fat man on the top of a bridge that goes over a railroad. Okay, so hold on to that. Hold on to that thought. Hold on to that man. Don't let him fall. At least maybe we should let him fall. I don't know. On down the line. But if I was spending all my money on ice cream, that's expensive ice cream that tastes really darn good, well, then I wouldn't be putting any money away for retirement, right? And at some point, unless I eat way too much ice cream, I might actually get to retirement age. And so, like I've been saying here, you have to balance all these factors. Right? So I spend a little bit of money on ice cream, and I don't buy the most expensive kind. I buy like Umpqua or Darigold. And I enjoy it on occasion, but not a lot. And I put away some money for retirement so that if I ever do live that long, well, then maybe I can actually retire. Right? And so you have to balance these various things as to what will cause the most amount of pleasure. In the long run does matter, but once again, how near or how far is the pleasure is a question. The next factor would be fecundity, the probability that the action will be followed by sensations of the same kind. My guess is that if you were to keep watching cat videos, the sensation of the mild pleasure of watching the cat video would probably wear off after a little while. It wouldn't have the same repeatability that some other pleasures might have. Whereas if you are investing in something like a long-term friendship, which by the way does cost time and energy and sometimes even some emotional heartache when you're working through friendships, right? That does take time. But the thing is, unlike playing like a video game where after a while, once you beat it, you can keep playing it over and over and over again, probably won't give you the same level of intense pleasure as it did originally. You'll probably get bored with it. But with a really good friendship, you can have that friendship not just now and not just a month from now, where the video game's starting to get old, but if you're playing that video game solid a year from now, you're definitely not enjoying it as much. And you can have a good friendship for 30 years or 60 years. In fact, I'll give you guys a little bit of a hint, and this may be more true for the guys than for girls, I don't know, but after 30, most men, and I think probably for quite a few women, don't tend to make really close friends. I don't know if you guys realize that. No one told me that, and then I hit 30, I'm like, gosh, it's hard to make friends anymore. That's just kind of how it is. And everyone's, oh yeah, everyone knows that. Okay, well, so there you have it. I'm giving you, so for the long run, it might be good time investment to have really good friendships. And the thing about friendships is that the pleasure within the friendship is repeatable over a very long period of time, unlike devoting yourself to playing a video game or something. The next factor is purity. And of course, this one can go both ways, right? Sometimes we might say that right now we'll experience a little bit of pain so that in the long run, things will be better. And then sometimes we say we'll experience pleasure now, and then in the long run, things will be worse. And that's not good. And so we can look at something like exercise, which is a little bit of pain now to give us physical health, and that's good for us in the long run. But how many of you have ever forced yourself to do some exercises when you just didn't feel like it? But you do it because it's good for you in the long run. Something else, so here, of course, would be, I think probably the big one when it comes to cocaine. cocaine does not have any pure qualities to it, right? For someone who does cocaine, I'm assuming that there's probably some sort of a hangover afterwards. Again, I don't have any idea. There's also potential addiction. There's also the excessive cost. And all these things can be detrimental to you over the long run, right? And this is especially true when it comes to the physical toll that it takes on your body. It might feel good for 20 minutes, then after that it's bad for you. It leads to addiction and it leads to bad health. And so purity is another one of these factors that you bring into your moral calculus to determine whether or not an action is right. Now, so far, we have looked at 6 of these factors, 6 of the 7 that go into Jeremy Bentham's calculus. And I think if you are an egoist and you want to be a smart egoist, you can look at every single one of these factors and apply that to you. Egoism is not just the pure pursuit of pleasure momentarily. It's the intelligent pursuit of pleasure over a long period of time. And every single one of these factors would add into that. So if you're an egoist, the means by which you achieve your personal benefit could very easily be the first 6 of 7 of Jeremy Bentham's moral calculus. What makes utilitarianism different is this next and final factor in the calculus, and that is extent. How many people will be affected by your actions? And this is where utilitarianism starts to look very different than egoism. It's the extent. Every human being is capable of some degree of pain or pleasure. And when I say that, I mean they receive stimuli that causes either pain or pleasure within the person. That said, there will be potentially some human beings that are actually worth more to other human beings. Let me repeat that. There are some human beings who are worth more to other human beings because they have more utility. So let's use an example that we all seem to sort of understand. The President of the United States has bodyguards, Secret Service that follow him around. And the Secret Service having their job to jump before a bullet for the president. And we're all okay with this sort of self-sacrifice. Why? Because the president has a particularly important job that affects a large number of people. To put it very bluntly, the Secret Serviceman is not that important. There's not as much utility in the job of a Secret Service person as there is for a president. And so we have jobs where, yes, you know, every person does experience pain and does experience pleasure, and on some level that's equal. However, not each person, but each person is not equally valuable to the rest of us. Hannah.
So would a utilitarian person like be okay? Well, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this, sorry. If they were under the impression, could this lead to genocide basically? Because if someone who is a utilitarian is under the impression that a person or a group of people are less important to humanity as a whole, would they just not feel anything if bad things or like murders were happening to that group or these people?
Yeah, you have a really, really good question. So we want to make sure that we don't fall into subjectivity, right? So subjectively, you might have a group that comes along and says, for the good of others, let's kill off the Jewish race. We'll call ourselves Nazis, right? And that did happen. The thing, though, is that that's not true, right? The killing off of Jewish people did not actually provide any utility. It caused the opposite of utility. And so it does not matter what one's opinion is about a group. What matters is the facts, and that is, does this group of people actually provide utility? Or are these people a drain on society? So now all of a sudden, Hannah, this is going to sound kind of terrible, but you're onto something. You just kind of went the wrong direction with it.
Wait, I wasn't trying to be onto something. I was trying to say that wouldn't that mean that utilitarianism is like in its core wrong, because if they saw anyone as being less than what they thought, I guess, the goal would be, then they would basically turn into like genocidal people.
Well, so I don't know that you say genocidal, although I suppose there's a potential, but you could say something along the lines of, supposing, you've got 5 people on a life raft, and one person is very, very large and is going to require, in order to stay hydrated, a lot more water than the rest of them, and they're not all going to survive. They can't split it all equally, right? All the little bit of water that they have left. They could all die, but split the water evenly, or they could kill the big guy that's going to take a lot more water, and so yeah, you'd have to do that in order to survive, and that would be okay.
So I guess my point is, would utilitarian people be okay with, do they think that certain people, just because of who they are less valuable, like intrinsically, than others?
No, they're less valuable because of extrinsically what they do for others. Okay, so no one is more or less intrinsically valuable, but people are less valuable extrinsically. Does that kind of make sense to everybody? Right? And so, yeah, that means the president is more valuable than I am. And if you had to sacrifice one or the other, you'd sacrifice me. Frankly, 18-year-old guys, you're not as valuable as the people that have their lives together and are in charge of politics. And so you're the ones who go off and fight and die in wars. We sacrifice you for the greater good. Yep. So once again, to go back to the calculus here, the extent, how many people will be affected? So something as simple as taking an aspirin is actually a moral act, and it's a good one for a utilitarian. If you have a headache, that pain is bad. Take an aspirin and you feel better. That's a morally good thing to do. But you know what's even better than that? Inventing aspirin. Because now you're affecting billions of people, not just yourself. So does that all kind of make sense to you guys? Okay. So Jeremy Bentham's type of utilitarianism has been termed act utilitarianism. And it says that each act should be evaluated for its probable utility and decisions should be made accordingly. We're going to critique this just a little bit. And the critique is going to come from actually one of Jeremy Bentham's own students. He's not going to go off the rails and become an absolutist. He's still going to be a utilitarian, but he's going to modify Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism just a little bit to make it a bit more user-friendly and to make it a little bit less strictly functional and allow for some other elements to be added into it. So let's talk really quickly here about John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was a student of Jeremy Bentham's. He was a very, very intelligent guy. He learned Greek by the age of 3, in addition to English, Greek, Latin a bit later, And by the time he was 12, he was already a competent mathematician. And by the time he was 16, he was already an accomplished economist. However, when he was 20 years old, after living a life of like very strenuous utilitarianism, he had a mental breakdown where he came to grips with the ethics that he had been brought up with, utilitarianism, and decided that there has to be something, that there's something missing from the utilitarian equation. And so you're going to be reading about that for Wednesday in Smart's article in the course pack. It's only 2 pages. You guys can read it just fine. We'll have a little quiz over that. And that's kind of the background as to why there's a concern over quality. And then the second adaptation that he makes to utilitarianism is what we're going to call rule utilitarianism. So we've got act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism, and those are the 2 main branches of utilitarianism that the other variations kind of come off from, generally speaking. So let's talk a little bit about how rule utilitarianism is different from Jeremy Bentham's act utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham says every single action that you take must be evaluated for its utility. But what this means is that there is no generally right or wrong actions. Even things like Hannah had brought up, what about genocide? Well, you could say genocide is probably wrong most of the time, but theoretically you could come up with a scenario that genocide is actually the right thing to do. Or to put it even just more simply, what about murdering people? Is that right or wrong? Well, you'd probably tell your kids murdering is wrong because the rule has utility, but it's a lie. Oh, by the way, utilitarians are perfectly fine with lies if the lie has utility, right? Lying is fine if there is utility in the lie. So you can tell your kids that murder is wrong, but murder is not necessarily wrong, truthfully speaking. Sometimes murder is right. And so this makes doing what is right in difficult circumstances hard to know, right? So a lot of times it's pretty obvious what you should do. A lot of times there's a moral dilemma that is really not too difficult. Oh, look, there's a kid who's in the lake and he's having trouble and he's little and I'm big and I can walk right after him, pick him up and save him. What should you do? Save the kid. It's not hard, right? Like every single ethical system, except for maybe egoism, and most people have sympathetic hearts and want to save the kid, would say go save the kid. But what about those situations where it becomes quite difficult, where you really don't know what to do because it could go either way? You're not sure if the consequences will produce utility or not. Well, according to act utilitarianism, you got nothing, right? Does that make sense? Like, if you don't know what the results are going to be, you have no moral direction. And what's the whole purpose of having ethics? To tell you what you should do. And so in the difficult spots, utilitarianism doesn't work. Okay, imagine this. You find yourself standing on a little cover or on a bridge that goes over railroad tracks, and down below you notice that there is on the railroad track speeding an empty boxcar heading right underneath the tracks where you're standing. And then you look at the other side and you realize, oh gosh, there's a whole bunch of kids, 20 kids sitting over there, in the track, and they all look like they're playing and having a good time. The parents are nowhere to be found. Uh-oh, that empty boxcar is going to plow through those kids, and it's going to be a massacre. You also notice that standing on the bridge right next to you, keep in mind that this is a low-railed bridge, a very tall, very, very fat man, I'm talking like pear-shaped fat man on stilts. A little shove, and Mr. Fat Man, who probably also has diabetes, let's face it, is going down on the track, slowing down the boxcar, and saving the kids. 20 kids could be saved here by pushing this old, unhealthy, fat man. What's the right thing to do for the utilitarian? How many of you think the right thing to do is to push the fat man? Come on. Fat man's going down.
Being able to accurately predict whether that would actually improve the situation, I believe, is beyond the human capability of
Calculating, you're right. Yeah, so once again, this goes right back to the very critique we're talking about. Much of the time, the consequences are too unknowable to make a reasonable moral decision, right? I mean, there's multiple different things that could happen here. Maybe the boxcar is, going to plow over the fat man and it won't slow it down that much. Maybe the fat man is a genius. You know, we don't want to throw a genius over for a bunch of, dirty kids playing on a railroad track, right? Maybe the fat man will bounce. Not real likely, but you never know. Maybe your aim will be bad. You push him over and you miss the track by 3 feet and he splats beside the train and the train goes and hits the kids anyway. So, in other words, lots of times the consequences are too unknowable to make reasonable moral decisions. Even if you could use the fat man's body to stop the train from hitting the kids, and you knew for sure that would happen, it's pretty obvious with 20 kids, yeah, you'd sacrifice the fat man. But what if you had 3 kind of dopey, dumb-looking kids and 1 fat man who might be a genius? Okay, well, even if you know you can stop the train with his body, is it worth it? 3 dopey-looking kids, 1 genius fat man. What do? You see why act utilitarianism becomes difficult in actually difficult circumstances. Hannah.
Also, couldn't you just yell? Like, you didn't necessarily need to sacrifice anyone if you were able to alert the kids, yeah, right? Because there are a lot of situations where it could be like, there's gray area, there's not one or the other. You could do something else, I guess.
Well, maybe. Potentially, you look over and you notice that there's a bus parked next to the track that says School of the Deaf. And you see the doors open, the kids all got off there, so.
Alternatively, you notice that everyone has headphones on.
Or that. So these are what we call thought experiments to see if our reasoning works in these situations. I'm not saying that there aren't other alternatives. There usually are other alternatives that are perhaps morally better, but if those were your only 2 options, what would the right thing be to do? And that's where act utilitarianism really struggles. Because under a circumstance where even if you know for sure the consequences, is it worth it, right? 3 grubby kids versus 1 maybe genius fat man, maybe not so genius. I don't know. Like, who do you sacrifice there? And so both those things are issues. You don't know the outcome necessarily, and even if you do, sometimes it's hard to know which is actually the better option. And in those circumstances, act utilitarianism provides no moral guidance, and that is a major critique for act utilitarianism. Mill tries to fix that with what we're going to call rule utilitarianism. And you should act according to the rule whose adoption will produce the most good. Aha! Do we want a society with everyone running around murdering? Or do we want a society better and happier if people aren't murdering? Obviously, not murdering. And so with the Mill situation, you can teach your kids that murder is wrong. And it actually is wrong most of the time. And so you do have direction here. Should I push the fat man? Should I not? Oh, I remember the rule. Don't push fat people in front of trains. And so you don't do that, right? You don't push fat people in front of trains. And on the other hand, if you know for certain that by if we don't go to war and shut down Hitler, the world's going to be taken over by fascist Nazis. All the Jewish people are going to be exterminated. All sorts of freedom is going to be gone. Okay, here we have a different scenario where sometimes you have to go kill, and that means you have to kill sometimes on the battlefield. Right? Killing isn't good in and of itself. In fact, that's the rule. Don't kill. But in war, now you can kill someone that never did you any harm. 18-year-old guy on one side shoots an 18-year-old guy on the other side. It's utilitarian calculus, and you can be a rule utilitarian and violate the rules when it's clear that you are truly affecting utility in the positive way. Hannah.
So I'm a little bit confused. Do utilitarians think that there's nothing that's actually completely good or completely bad, but it's only completely good or completely bad within circumstances?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, especially with act utilitarianism. With act utilitarianism, it's all about circumstances. So killing isn't good or bad. It's only good or bad based upon the circumstances. With rule utilitarianism, it's no. You should follow the rules most of the time. All right, guys, and with that, unless you have any questions, I hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll see you later. If you do have any questions, feel free to stay on, and I'll talk with you after everyone else is gone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
You too.